The question did not arrive suddenly. It crept into Diep's life the way unease often does, quietly between ordinary moments, hiding behind routines that looked harmless from the outside. It lived in unanswered calls, in postponed plans, in the careful tone James used when he spoke of later instead of now. Father James was not a man who needed to raise his voice. His power was older, heavier, built on wealth, reputation, and the unspoken belief that control was a form of love. People listened to him not because they feared him, but because they had learned that resisting him changed nothing. Doors opened when he wished them to open. They closed just as easily. Diep understood this long before she ever met him. She felt his presence in the shape of James's absence, in the distance that stretched wider with each passing day. James loved her, of that she was certain, but love, she was learning, was not always enough when it had to pass through the hands of another man. Her days remained stubbornly ordinary. She worked, paid wages, worried about money, and laughed with Nee over small, fleeting joys. The simplicity of her life made the weight pressing against it feel even heavier. How could something so gentle be threatened by something so powerful? People around her spoke in half sentences. They advised patience, understanding, sacrifice. He comes from a different world, they said, as if worlds were not meant to touch. Diep smiled and nodded, though inside her chest, questions grew restless. Was love supposed to shrink itself to fit into someone else's expectations? At night, when the house grew quiet, she allowed herself to wonder. She imagined a future where James stood freely beside her, unburdened by permission or fear. Then she imagined the opposite, a future where she slowly faded from his life, not because love had died, but because it had been suffocated, gently, politely, beyond rescue. Father James had not spoken to her yet. That silence was deliberate. It was the kind of silence that demands obedience before words are even exchanged. Diep felt it pressing closer, an invisible boundary waiting to be crossed. And so the question lingered, unresolved and heavy. Would he loosen his grip and let love breathe? Or would Diep's love be stifled before it ever had the chance to stand on its own?
Loss does not always arrive with final goodbyes. Sometimes it announces itself through distance, through the slow unraveling of what once felt secure. Diep sensed it in the way James's voice softened, and how their conversations grew shorter, weighed down by things he could not say. She tried to hold on to normalcy. Each morning she returned to her work, her hands busy with tasks that grounded her in reality. She paid workers, bargained carefully, and made sure Nie ate well. These small responsibilities gave her strength, yet they also reminded her how fragile her world was. Love did not protect her from uncertainty. It simply made the stakes higher. James struggled in silence. He spoke of obligations, of timing, of responsibilities that pulled him away. Diep heard the conflict beneath his words, the push and pull between devotion and duty. She wanted to ask him to choose, but she knew that love should never be an ultimatum. And so she waited, though waiting hurt more than any argument could. People around her noticed the change. Some spoke gently, urging her to prepare herself. Others warned her outright. Men like him do not live by their own rules, they said. When families like his decide something, love is expected to step aside. Their words echoed in Diep's mind, not as truth, but as a possibility she could no longer ignore. At night, doubt crept in. She questioned herself in the quiet moments when hope grew thin. Was her love too small to survive this pressure? Or was it too strong, refusing to let go even when letting go might bring peace? She wondered how many people lived their lives on this same edge, loving deeply while knowing they might be asked to disappear. Then came the message she had both feared and expected, a request for a meeting. Brief, formal,
unavoidable. It was not from James, but from his father. The words carried no threat, yet Diep felt her breath catch as she read them. This was the moment she had been standing on the edge of for so long. She did not tell James right away. Some battles, she knew, had to be faced alone. Preparing herself, Diep looked at her life, simple, honest, unprotected by power. She did not know what would be taken from her, only that something would change. As she folded her phone away, one thought remained steady amid the fear. If love was to be stifled, it would not be because she lacked courage. Some conversations are decided long before the first word is spoken. Diep understood this the moment she stepped into the room where Father James waited. The space was quiet, controlled, and carefully arranged, much like the man himself. Outside, life continued in its usual rhythm: traffic, voices, the soft chaos of an ordinary day. Inside, everything felt suspended, as if time itself were holding its breath. He greeted her politely, too politely. His tone carried no warmth, only authority refined into calmness. He did not ask about her life, her work, or her struggles. Instead, he spoke of James, his future, his responsibilities, the weight of a family name that could not afford uncertainty. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, leaving no room for emotion. Diep listened, her heart rising and falling with the rhythm of his words. She felt small, not because she lacked worth, but because the world he described had no space for someone like her. Love, in his eyes, was a risk, unpredictable, uncontrollable, unnecessary. When it was her turn to speak, Diep did not defend herself with anger. She spoke of ordinary things instead: early mornings, honest work, the kind of life built without shortcuts. She spoke of James not as an asset, but as a man who deserved to choose who he loved without fear. Her voice wavered once, then steadied. Courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. Father James listened without interruption. His expression did not change, yet his silence grew heavier. Then he responded, not with rejection, but with conditions: distance, time, sacrifice. Words that sounded reasonable, even kind, but carried the weight of an unspoken demand: disappear quietly, and everyone would be spared discomfort. The room felt smaller. Diep understood the cruelty of such mercy. To leave without blame, without conflict, this was how love was stifled, slowly and cleanly. She rose from her seat, her decision forming not in defiance, but in clarity. She did not promise obedience. She did not plead. She simply said, "Love cannot survive in shadows." As she walked away, Diep felt the cost pressing against her chest. Whatever came next would change everything. Yet she also knew this: silence would no longer protect anyone. The answer did not come immediately. Life rarely offers clarity when we ask for it most. Instead, days passed in a quiet tension, the kind that settles into everyday routines and makes even simple moments feel fragile. Diep returned to her work, to the familiar rhythm of effort and endurance, yet everything felt suspended, as if her life were waiting for permission to continue. James felt the change before he understood it. Something in him resisted the invisible walls that had always guided his steps. The conversations with his father grew strained, filled with pauses that spoke louder than words. Control, once disguised as protection, began to feel like a cage. For the first time, James asked himself a question he had avoided for years. If love must be abandoned to preserve obedience, what remains of a life well lived? Father James watched his son carefully. He had expected silence, compliance, gratitude. What he saw instead was distance, not rebellion, but withdrawal. The realization unsettled him. Power was effective only when it inspired fear or dependence, and James was beginning to feel neither. The cost of holding on, the father discovered, might be greater than the cost of letting go. Diep did not wait. She understood that love, when trapped between permission and refusal, slowly suffocates. One evening, as the sky dimmed and ordinary lights flickered on across the city, she made her choice. She wrote James a letter, not asking him to choose her, not asking him to fight, but giving him freedom. She told him she would step back, not because she was defeated, but because love should never be the reason someone feels trapped. James read the letter in silence. It broke something open inside him. Love, he realized, was not being taken from him, it was being trusted. That trust demanded honesty, not obedience. When James finally confronted his father, there were no raised voices, only truth. He spoke of love as a choice, not a weakness. He spoke of Diep not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who had taught him courage. Father James listened and, for the first time, said nothing. Whether he let her go out of mercy or out of fear of losing his son, no one could say. What mattered was this: the grip loosened. Diep's love was not stifled. It survived, not because it won, but because it refused to disappear quietly. And sometimes that is the bravest ending life allows. The story of Diep and James offers a lesson that feels deeply familiar in everyday life, where love is often tested not by a lack of feeling, but by power, expectations, and invisible boundaries. It reminds us that the greatest obstacles to love are not always distance or hardship, but control disguised as concern. First, the story teaches that love cannot survive where freedom is denied. Father James believes that protection and authority give him the right to decide his son's future, yet love, by its nature, demands choice. Diep's courage lies not in fighting for possession, but in insisting that love must breathe. Her willingness to step back shows that real love does not trap, it liberates. Second, the lesson highlights the quiet strength of dignity. Diep never raises her voice, never humiliates herself, and never begs to be accepted. In a world that often measures worth through status and power, she proves that dignity comes from integrity. Her calm resistance reflects the strength many ordinary people carry as they face unfair judgments in daily life. Another important lesson is about generational control. Parents may believe they are protecting their children, yet sometimes they protect only their own fears. Father James learns that holding too tightly risks losing what matters most. Letting go is not weakness, it is trust. Finally, the story teaches that love is not about winning or losing. Diep does not demand a perfect ending. She chooses honesty over comfort, freedom over certainty. In doing so, she preserves her self-worth and allows love to exist without conditions. In the end, the lesson is clear and enduring. Love cannot be stifled by force, but it can be destroyed by silence and fear. Only when we allow others the freedom to choose do we truly honor love and ourselves.